Hello. Today I'm going to be discussing the Iran versus Iraq conflict. The global political challenge I've selected today is borders. Tensions between these two nations began in 1921, right after Iraq formed. A main source of conflict between the two was over the Shatt al-Arab waterway, joined by the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. This waterway is located in the southern border of Iraq and Iran, and is a high point of tension between the two nations. Many agreements were signed over this river, but none really stuck. In 1975, the Algiers Agreement was signed, which states that Iran could have main control of the Shatt al-Arab, given that they withdraw forces from northern Iraq. It is important to understand this conflict because it's the basis for the ongoing tensions that are in the Persian Gulf and Arabian Peninsula. There hasn't been a sense of security restored to this area because of this conflict, which kind of kicked everything off. Because of the need for resources and a sovereign claims to the land from many different nations, the conflict hasn't settled. Many Western powers have been roped in, such as the US in 2003 when they had to invade Iraq to try and topple Saddam Hussein's regime. I've chosen borders as my global political challenge today because the conflict I'll be speaking about is about the Shatt al-Arab, which is right on the border between the two. So it seems like a good point to start with because it's right on the area where they would meet. This conflict is definitely related to borders because the two countries had to make several agreements over the Shatt al-Arab, but none of them have really stuck together. And when these agreements fall through, both powers are still contesting for the land, and they feel they have sovereign claims that make the land rightfully theirs when obviously the other disagrees. Two IB core concepts I'm going to be discussing today are sovereignty and violence. So to start with sovereignty, there are four main aspects of sovereignty that both nations feel why the Shatt al-Arab belongs to them. First, there's the economic reason. So Iran uses the river to ship large amounts of crude oil and run their industry. It's very beneficial for their economy. Iraq also needs it to ship resources and to access the Persian Gulf, where lots of harbors and trading will go on. There's an ethnic region for this sovereignty claims because Iran is descended from the Persian Empire, while Iraq is descended from the Ottoman Empire. Traditionally, these two empires have butt heads quite a bit, and the Shatt al-Arab is a natural border between the two. So both feel they have sovereign claims because they want to be better than the other group. Because of the border agreements, Iran feels that they rightfully own it, as of the Algiers Agreement that I discussed before. But Iraq feels they own it because they need access to the Persian Gulf. There's another aspect of sovereignty, agriculture. Both nations are in a very dry area and need access to the water provided by the Shatt al-Arab to both grow crops as well as, feed people and keep them alive, because obviously water is a necessity. There's the geographical reason, because without the Shatt al-Arab controlled by Iraq, they have no way of entering the Persian Gulf, which would also loop in with the economic side, so trade would decrease and the economy of Iraq would not be looking good if they don't have access to their ports that the Shatt al-Arab links them to. The Shatt al-Arab is symbolic of this traditional conflict of Persians versus Arabs. They both feel they need to be better than the other. They both feel the land is theirs. So it's really a historical butting of heads, which is similar with a lot of the countries in this area of the world. We can analyze this conflict on a regional level because the Iraqis feel the water is total Arab, and obviously Iran disagrees. So this is a regional dispute over the river itself, the waterway itself. We can also connect to this on another level analysis of a national level, because the pride both nations feel drives them to compete for this land. So both nations have a strong sense of nationalism, strong sense of patriotism, and they both want to contest for this land and make it their own. They both want to prove that their ethnic background is superior to the other, which results in this conflict and, large amounts of conflict that have gone down between the two. We can also connect this on an international level of analysis because without the waterway, economies in this area can be crippled and vast amounts of oil cannot be exported easily. So if Iran does not have control of it, they have to find alternative ways to get the oil out of their country, which might prove difficult and would affect the international oil industry. Same goes for Iraq if they don't have it. So either way, the oil industry and many other economic things would be heavily affected. The second core concept I'm going to be speaking about is violence. So obviously, I've talked about before, the historical tension between Arabs and Persians is motivation enough for violence. They both want to feel superior. They both have nationalism. They both have patriotism. They both want to be dominant over the other, which obviously this land is shared between the two, so they both want to go for it and take it for themselves. There's conflict on a national level in this conflict because it started right after Iran came out of the revolution in 1978 to 79, and that would eventually set off Saddam Hussein's original invasion into Iran to gain land and oil and the Shah al-Arab, ultimately. Both really need the water from the river. It's a necessity for their people. It's a very dry region, very hot region, and there's not a lot of water around, so it's essential that they both gain this land. We can relate this conflict to an international level of violence because Iraq was not satisfied, because when they did invade Iran eventually, they were driven out by Iran, which led them to invade Kuwait and set off the whole Persian Gulf instability that still goes on today. They invaded Kuwait for oil, and this also led America to come in and look for a change in leadership to topple Saddam Hussein's regime. They believed he wasn't a good leader for Iraq, and he was starting too much tensions. So that's how the 2003 Iraq War came to be. There's economic motivation for the violence because Iraq wanted to invade Iran for oil, and as I said before, then Kuwait for oil, started the Gulf War because of it. So there's economic motivation. They want to gain some money. They want to gain some resources from the other nations in the area. So when Iran did have its revolution in 1978 and 1979, the westernized government of the Shah was taken out and the Islam Republic emerged. The leader of Iraq, Saddam Hussein, feared that this new government of Iran would look to expand into other Muslim populations around the area. And so out of fear, he went back on the border agreements that made in 1975, the Algiers Agreement, and again began to contest for the Shah al-Arab. This eventually drove him to actually invade Iran on September 22nd of 1980. His invasion started with airstrikes that were launched on Iranian air bases, and Iraq also invaded on the ground to move on the oil region of Khuzestan. Iraq was actually successful by capturing the city of Khorramshahr, but Iran's resistance came back strong as the revolutionary forces joined the military to fight back. So the reason Saddam Hussein actually originally invaded was because they just came out of their revolution. He believed their military would be weak and that he would be able to actually, take away the oil relatively easily. But Iran did get their stuff together and united both their military and their revolutionary forces to fight back against Iraq. So in 1981, Iran did counterattack on Iraq, and by 1982, all the lost territory that they had lost from the invasion was taken back. By the time Iraq was pushed all the way back, they did offer a peace treaty. Iran refused, looking to topple Saddam's regime in July 1982. Iran invaded to gain the city of Basra. They were unsuccessful at doing this, and this would not be the first time they tried to invade to get Basra, so the conflict continued even after Iraq was driven out of Iran. We can also relate this conflict to the conflict in Kashmir, which is a contested region between China, Pakistan, and India, but the dispute is mainly between India and Pakistan. There's obviously big religious differences between the two, as they were divided from each other. So both feel sovereign claims to the land, both have extreme violence in this area, and it is a big point of contention in the world. So this is kind of a similar thing. There's ethnic divides. There's a big background, there's a feel of need to be more powerful than the other, superior than the other people involved in the conflict, which actually drives this to actually happen. So in conclusion, the original violence that started the war was based on economic gain and the need to take the Shatt al-Arab for both geographical and economic and agricultural purposes. The violence was motivated heavily by the historical feud and the strategic importance that the Shatt al-Arab holds. This case has taught me the importance of geography and how the separation of a country to its ports can cripple economy. So without the Shatt al-Arab, Iraq will have big problems to, trade and stuff, because that's their only connection to the Persian Gulf. They'd be cut off from their ports. It would cause a big problem. And when they were threatened to be cut off from their ports, this drove them to invade other areas to gain economic power, like Iran and eventually Kuwait. And that hasn't been resolved. The Persian Gulf War is still going on. It's important to understand conflicts like this so we can see how old tensions can spark geopolitical war on a massive scale, and also how to diplomatically avoid disputes like this in coming times. Thank you for listening. Hope you learned a lot.